Welcome, everyone. Well, this is a real privilege for me to be in conversation with these two gentlemen. Let me start out by asking a little bit about the origins of the book. You both, Alan is an economist, renowned for his detailed knowledge of the U.S. economy and his ability to cite the most arcane statistics about things. Adrian is a business historian. How did this book develop? Who had the idea? How was it to work together? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, Scott Moore is of Penguin, the publisher, who's my publisher. Is he your publisher?
Absolutely.
It's not a surprise. Called me one day and said, we have a job for you. And I said, what is it? He said, we'd like you to write a book on the economic history of the United States. And I said, hey, wait a second. I'm not a historian. He says, quiet. We're your publisher. We're your editor. You're a historian. And besides, we're going to ask Adrian Wooldridge to help in the project. So when your publisher says that, you are mute thereafter. So here we are.
And how did you organize the division of labor? Because it's hard to write it's hard enough to write a book alone. Writing one jointly.
Well, what was even more annoying was I used to work in Washington, D.C., round the corner from Dr. Greenspan when I didn't know him at all. And now I work in London, so we had to, there was a certain amount of logistical problems, but I actually persuaded The Economist to give me 3 months off. So I spent quite a lot of time in Washington. And then we talked through the arguments and the material of the book. Then we would then exchange things over the telephone and over the internet. So it's actually not as difficult a process as we'd worried about, I think.
So before I get into the book, Alan, we can't have you here without asking you questions about your career. So you've made history, and now you're writing about history. Does it add did you have an added perspective from having been such a singular figure in the economic policy history making of this country?
I'm not sure what that means, but what I was supposed to give. I don't think people react that way. At least they shouldn't. I worked in government for almost 20 years, and I'm fundamentally somebody who believes in free enterprise, and government is usually not the major source of income of an economist like myself. But I got so interested in what I was doing that whenever I got anything was appointed by a president, I decided that it's worth a try, and I'm very glad that I did.
So, I mean, let me make the question more concrete. You criticize FDR for some of his decisions. You have very strong views about what went wrong in the 1970s in the economy, which were clearly policy mistakes. Did being a policymaker for so long add a perspective on those on the decisions that these people made?
Well, of course, because you have retrospection, and it's very easy to do that. This book is not, incidentally, anti-Roosevelt. What we did say, and because we merely were quoting Henry Morgenthau, who was a close friend and Secretary of the Treasury for Franklin Roosevelt, and he basically said before the Ways and Means Committee in 1940 that the New Deal has been a failure. We spent a lot of money, and we created a lot of debt, and we have as much unemployment now as we did at the beginning. What made Roosevelt a very important figure is he really was extraordinary as a World War II president. But more importantly, he was very important in the just the months before World War II, because he developed Lend-Lease. I'm not sure Lend-Lease was constitutional, but he phrased it in a manner which made it seem like you were borrowing a hose from your neighbor and you would give it back. And so we were able to help Britain at the time, and in retrospect, that was a very critical decision because the United States at that time was extraordinarily isolationist. I mean, the thought of helping anybody during the war in Europe was considered dangerous. And Roosevelt did a number of things which I'm not certain were legal. But if he didn't do them, we may not all be here today. We'd be under a different regime. So on the one hand, I've never been a fan of what Roosevelt did in his first term, even though in his second term, when he was reelected, he had an overwhelming vote. But I had very considerable admiration for the guts that he had to do things which were most other presidents would not have done. And I think he saved the world in that respect, so that the notion of my being anti-Roosevelt is accurate for the peacetime, but as a wartime president, he and Winston Churchill, who depended on the United States for the physical resources which we could produce and they couldn't, and enabled them to get through 1940, 1941.
So, I mean, I should tell the audience this book is not just a series of dry economic statistics. It is actually very rich with political and social judgment. So congratulations to both of you. So let me get to the substance of the book. The fundamental thesis of the book is that the key to American economic success has been its high rate of growth of productivity. Why? What made the U.S. have such a high rate, for such a long period of time, have a high rate of growth of productivity than its peers?
Well, I lived there, so I'm not a good observer, but he didn't. So
Okay, let's, Adrian.
Well, let me start off by saying the book starts off imagining a meeting of Davos in 1618. It imagines that all the great and the good of the world come together to discuss what will be the dominant power in the coming centuries. And you have people from China, people from Turkey, people from Europe, and they're all discussing who will rule in the next 400 years. And there's a good case in this imaginary meeting to be made for China, a good case for Turkey, a good case for India, a good case for Spain. There's even a good case for England, which is just about to break with the ossified and backward continent of Europe. But in this imaginary meeting, nobody at all mentions the United States. It's not even an afterthought in civilized discourse at that time. It's just a collection of isolated colonies hanging on the edge of the world. And then over the next 400 years, this becomes the motor of progress, the most powerful country in the world. It's the most extraordinary fact about the last 400 years, that a country can come from nowhere to be the engine of growth. And we argue that the reason that America takes on this dominant role is because it is a country that is more willing to engage in what we call creative destruction. It's more willing to engage in economic growth and the change and the disruption that economic growth brings with it. Why is America so predisposed to creative disruption? And we look at various explanations. One is that America is so big, much bigger than any European country, so that you can move around. If something doesn't work anymore, you can move somewhere else. One is that it's a new country, that America is the first country really to be created in the age of business, in the age of commerce, in the age of growth. It doesn't have the inheritance of the feudal past that held Europe back. I think those are quite compelling reasons for that. Another reason is that America has a constitution that provides people with property rights, provides restraints on power. It means that the government doesn't control everything, that the government has lots of limits on what it does. And I think a final reason is that America has an appetite for business. It treats entrepreneurs as heroes. In Britain, we like landed gentlemen. In France, they like bureaucrats and intellectuals. In Germany, they like scholars. America likes, above all, businessmen. Being the entrepreneur is the ultimate thing. So America has a business culture. America also has corporations. America was founded by corporations like the Massachusetts Bay Company and the Virginia Company. America was the first country to let companies free. In the past, it used to be the case that in order to set up a company, you had to go to the government and say, I want to set up a company for this specific purpose. America was the first country in the 1830s to allow people to set up companies for any general purpose they wanted to do. And finally, America allows companies to become big very, very fast, to grow and become continent-sized companies. So I think all of these reasons have given America an incredible competitive advantage in the world of creative destruction. So that's the optimistic story in the book. The rather more pessimistic story, as we say towards the end of the book, that this advantage in creative destruction is beginning to fade. And so the great question we end with is if you had another Davos meeting now, would you be predicting that America will retain its position as the world's most powerful economy, or is it going to hand over to another less democratic country such as China?
Alan, you want to add anything to that?
No, it's really quite remarkable. Whenever he talks, I agree with everything he says. And from what I can judge, whenever I talk, he agrees with me. So it's the ideal couple, but I'm not sure it's the optimum one.
So let me ask you about the destruction portion of creative destruction, because clearly it means that in order for this to work, you can't protect the losers in this whole process. And that's quite a sort of austere way of running economic policy. Can you talk a little bit about what is it about the political system that allows that to happen?
Well, let me go back to the economics for a minute, because I think it's important to realize why is it, or how does creative destruction increase the standard of living? And the best way is to observe how it happens. It invariably is, for example, in the latter part of the 19th century, steel in the early stages was a very precious metal, so to speak. I think it was largely in Sheffield, in Britain.
Yes.
Until, of all things, a Brit, Henry Bessemer, invented the Bessemer steel process. What that did was to very significantly reduce the cost the cost, meaning use of resources, to produce really what was fine steels in very large volumes. But when you reduce the cost of something, that's what galvanizes it. If the cost didn't get reduced, in the unit cost, so to speak, it wouldn't be produced. So creative destruction is really generated by the reduction in costs. And you can see why a business operation is trying to maximize its profit. It tries to reduce its costs as one major aspect of its behavior. And so what has been happening over the years is essentially that process, and it was especially during the latter part of the 19th century. But it's important to realize that in the process, you lose a lot of people's well-being and job. I mean, there's so many wonderful examples about how it works and when and who gets hurt and what. But for example, if you're going to produce, let's say, Bessemer steel, all the people who are involved in a lesser product such as Sheffield steel are out of work. And the technologies don't work, and a lot of people of necessity suffer until they get another job. So the difficult political problem is what in the world, how do you handle this? Well, the way the American society handled it is by the 19th century, when creative destruction and displacement was beginning to get very substantial, labor unions began to arise. They didn't arise in the first part of the century, largely because it was mainly craft unions, and people didn't work for anybody else; they worked for themselves. And there were craft. I guess you call them craft unions, but it was a different position, which changed very dramatically when we started to move forward and create large corporations, and which my colleague here is an expert on. That was not a joke.
No, he's written a couple of books.
No, that's not a joke. But the issue here is that there's no way to eliminate what happens, for example, to telegraphers when the telephone emerges, nor what happens to the Pony Express when railroads get built. So you can't have it both ways. You either get lowered unit costs along the line and hence increasingly higher standards of living. You think in terms, unit cost is the same thing as price. And the basic issue of creative destruction is its tendency is to push prices down for an existing product. And that's what the process has been. It's been extraordinarily successful. And it is the essential answer to how we got here as being the most powerful economic power in the world.
But we have to qualify a little bit the sense of the brutality of creative destruction. Because imagine that you resist creative destruction. Imagine that you want to preserve old technologies or old jobs and just keep the economy in aspic, or you protect inefficient industries. What you tend to do if you do that is you can keep jobs for a while, but then they quite often collapse. So in countries that have been more averse to creative destruction than the United States, you tend to have much higher levels of unemployment, and you also get economic
And I think you guys make the point that the frontier and the fact that you had the frontier, which meant that wages in this country were higher than everywhere else. Was if you like, an economic safety net to this process.
The only thing that'll push wages up is for the demand to be there, and unless there is creative destruction, that demand does not exist.
Right. So, one of the most fascinating chapters is the chapter comparing the North and the South. I certainly learned an enormous amount. And the basic idea was that this culture that promoted innovation was essentially a northern culture. And we had a natural experiment where we had the South, which was a very different culture. It did not promote innovation. And both regions start out with the same level of income in about 1800. And by 1860, the North is, 40% richer. Talk a little bit about that whole, that chapter, because it really is interesting.
Well, let's understand how it became richer. Slavery, aside from its obvious very malodorous characterizations I would put to it, is not an efficient means by which you create anything. Remember that if you're a slave owner, you make certain that your slaves don't learn to read and write and improve. So one of the crucial aspects of how economies develop is the intellectual capacity of the workforce is a very crucial input. And so that was basically stable. And then there's a very serious question as to whether without the forced labor of slavery, we would have had the competitive capabilities ultimately built up. And the one thing that I regret in some odd way, I don't know, let me tell you what my problem is. As I recall, it was 1834 that Britain abolished slavery. And then in 1807, I think it was, there was actually a bill which passed and was signed by the President of the United States, who at that time was an owner of slaves. And it looked as though the bill which eliminated the ability to import slaves, it looked as though the track that Britain had taken everybody else to abolish slavery was going to impact on the United States. And then the great irony, considering what our thesis is the cotton gin showed up. And this was basically a displaced northerner in the South, Eli Whitney. And what the cotton gin did was to very significantly reduce the cost of producing, the input cost of producing cotton. And what the problem was is that taking the seeds out of a bowl of cotton was a very laborious thing. And his invention, which was not a very complex one, was to find a procedure by which you could very rapidly de-seed the cotton boll. The result was a tremendous increase in productivity, or put another way around, the unit cost of cotton production declined measurably. And that caused a major expansion in cotton production, basically because the price of the cost of the operations were so small. But as the costs declined, you got a very odd combination of forces that the best way of putting it, I guess, is that the gin itself reduced the cost of producing it, and where we had so-called Sea Island cotton, which is an extraordinarily expensive cotton, which exists to this day, we went to the issue of being able to produce what was called upland cotton in the United States, which is off the shore. And that upland cotton became extraordinarily profitable. And the result was it increased the demand for slaves. So if you look at the price of slaves, it looks like exactly what you would expect from the cost, inversely, of what happened with cotton production. And as a result, cotton, which had not been a major product in the South, tobacco was a bigger issue, swept through the South into Texas when it arrived, and was at one point in the middle part of the 19th century, the major international crop. And we were the major supporter of the mills at Manchester, England, and slavery became an extremely broadly held thing because the number of slaves was far greater as we got into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s than at any time previously. So that I often wonder that clearly it was terribly obvious that something is going to finally break apart, because a goodly part of the history of the United States in the 19th century, first part of the 19th century, I should say, was the issue of slavery versus many other things. But what I think was terribly interesting is that we got that far into the United States history before that very major, irreversible, irreducible issue of slavery versus freedom didn't explode. And when it finally did, there was a devastating war which took the Confederacy had higher losses than the North, but in general, it was a very dangerous, brutal war, and what came out of it was...
well, you have this fascinating graph which shows the value of slaves. And essentially, it was the single most valuable asset, absolutely, more valuable than land.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that it ended up with war.
One of the oddities of what's happening in the United States in the first half of the 19th century is you've got two economies that are pulling apart. You've got the economy of the North, which is based on industry, which is based on entrepreneurship, which is full of tinkerers who are improving plows, who are improving all sorts of mechanical things. And then you've got the economy of the South, which is based on coerced human labor. And because of the cotton economy taking off, more and more and more of the South's resources are focused on slavery and on cotton. So it goes from being a slightly diverse economy to being basically, by the 1850s, a cotton economy, and it's the world's greatest producer of cotton, and more people are enslaved, and they've got all sorts of ways of trying to squeeze, horrible, brutal, appalling ways of trying to squeeze more labor out of these slaves. So the economies are pulling in completely different directions. And one of the extraordinary things is you've got this very mighty economy developing in the North, and you'd think it would crush the South very, very rapidly, but the South actually holds on for quite a long time, because one thing they're good at is war. It's the martial class that runs the Southern economy. So it takes a long time for the economic power of the North to assert itself.
So, turning to the post-Civil War period, what's a theme of this book is there is a recurring tension between business and government, and you almost get you almost depict these cycles of alternating periods when business is in the ascendancy, followed by periods of when government is in the ascendancy. Can you talk about that as a theme of U.S. history?
Well, one of the extraordinary things is the theme of this book is creative destruction, and the extraordinary thing that you have in the period really from 1865 to 1914 is almost a pure laboratory of creative destruction. You have the creation of gigantic companies such as Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, and you have the rise of great entrepreneurs such as Carnegie and such as Rockefeller. Huge organizations coming from nothing to becoming dominant forces in the United States. And for a long time, all of that happens without really any interference by the government. You haven't got a Federal Reserve, you haven't got much of a state in Washington. Washington is this small, sleepy town where not very much happens. There's no real system of taxation. So it's a laboratory of entrepreneurialism. But then towards the end of that period, you begin to get a backlash against that. You get the rise of labor unions, as we've heard. You get with Teddy Roosevelt, a much more activist president. You get the feeling that these corporations are too big; they need to be broken up. So you get the progressive movement, which begins to break them up. So laissez-faire followed by a correction. Again, in the 1920s. You get the idea that the business of America is business, again, a very laissez-faire attitude in most ways, followed by the 1930s, which is a sort of correction to that. So you see this pattern developing all the way through American history, which is government intervention coming to correct what is perceived to be the dysfunctions or extremism of the market.
I mean, you make a provocative statement at one point where you say the 1920s were arguably the last decade when the size of government could be restrained. And I've always somehow thought, there's just an inexorable trend for government to increase in size. I mean, do you actually think we could have stayed at the federal government at 5% of GDP?
I suspect not. In fact, the evidence is that we didn't.
Right.
It is really fascinating to read the annals of the 1920s. It's considered at this particular stage rum runners and gangsters and the like, but if you look at the data, it's an extraordinary period of economic growth and innovation. It's the time essentially when motor vehicles began to become a very critical issue, which essentially had one of those massive effects on society, because up until then, personal transportation was virtually non-existent at any high level. And you get into air travel develops at the time. But as you can see, even during the 1920s, it was very difficult to get the budget deficit down. They succeeded, but it was very obvious that the long-term trend, which bedevils the current period, was that it's very interesting in a political society such as ours to find advocates of spending programs, but very few people who want to pay for it. And that's one of the really critical issues that have emerged in today's environment. And unless you eliminate double entry bookkeeping, there's no way to do that. The consequences have been and will be extraordinary.
And one thing you get in the 1920s is an extraordinary process of democratization.
Right.
You get the democratization of various innovations, such as the motor car, which before that had been really something that only the elite could use. You get the democratization of home ownership, massive spread of home ownership. And you get also the democratization of the corporation. Up until then, corporations had tended to be owned by great titans of industry or by great bankers. And what you get in the 1920s is the beginning of a widely held public company. So large numbers of people holding shares in these companies. So it's popular, sort of popular capitalism developing in that era. I just wanted to say one thing about whether can the size of government ever decline. I think we have conducted an experiment with this, which is quite interesting in Sweden, where the size of government became so huge by the late 1990s that I think once you're paying 100% of your income on tax, you can't go. And they have cut it down from about 75% of GDP to about 49%.
So 75%. There is a ceiling.
There is a ceiling. You can go back down.
You talked about the late 19th century as this laboratory of laissez-faire. One theme that I'd be interested in is it was also the time when the U.S. was highly protectionist. And we think of protectionism as sort of the antithesis of a dynamic economy. So talk a little bit about the role that protectionism played in making the U.S. a manufacturing superpower.
remember that in the Constitution, the only source of income in the early United States was tariffs. And what a tariff is a tax. And when you bring it all the way up to date, for example, when you have these tariff wars, like for the United States and China, for example, currently, you're getting a situation in which both parties lose. Because as you withdraw the purchasing power, which is from the economy, which is what a tax is, you may improve the fiscal situation, but you create a very significant deflationary set of forces. There are winners and there are losers, and I shouldn't put it that way. There are only losers, but there are some who lose less than others and who then claim they won the war. No one wins a tariff war. It's just a question of who loses least. And I think it's embedded basically in our unwillingness to see what reality is. And one of the problems is essentially that because we didn't have an income tax and the Constitution prohibited it, tariffs were the only way to fund the United States, and our original funding, especially the Revolutionary War, was basically tariffs. And so it had a certain historical aura to them, but they're awful.
Well, there is a school of thought, stretching back to Hamilton, that says that America is protecting its infant industries and allows them to grow strong, and only then becomes a free trading country. And I'm very skeptical of that school of thought, partly because I think the real reason for the tariffs is revenue raising, not industrial planning. Secondly, because I don't really think that America's steel industry or America's oil industry was dependent on being protected from Britain's. They grow very, very quickly because America is very, very good at absorbing ideas and applying them at scale. So I don't think Carnegie is really pushing for tariffs, because he's not frightened of Britain. He's just so much better at doing it. And again with the automobile industry. So I don't think that the American industry grows behind these deliberately constructed tariff walls. And then we have, of course, the great Smoot-Hawley problem when they really do begin to put tariffs, and then it pushes everything down.
So we actually probably need to move to audience questions, but one last question from my side, which is the book ends on after this very uplifting story of this dynamic economy that has outpaced everyone else with high productivity growth. It ends on a pessimistic note and essentially addresses the question of why has productivity been so slow productivity growth has been so slow over the last, let's say, 30 years. Why?
Well,
and what's the solution?
Well, this is a particular problem in which data really matter. It turns out, although it didn't have to be that way, that starting with in the United States in 1935, when the Social Security Act got passed and we had the first entitlement, that we got a system which, if you look at the data from, say, 1965 to date, that the amount of entitlement growth, which has now, since 1935, expanded very substantially, is essentially driving out gross domestic savings. And the way you know that is that the sum of entitlements plus gross domestic savings of a society has been generally flat. And when you look at the two major components of the entitlements and the gross domestic savings, they're obviously going counter. And so you have the choice. Is it the economy which is driving, enhancing entitlements, or is it the law that is essentially meaning that entitlements drive out gross domestic savings? Gross domestic savings plus the savings we borrow from abroad, which is our current account deficit, are fundamentally, or actually by definition, equal to gross domestic investment. And the data unequivocally show that gross domestic investment, which is reflected in the building up of buildings, machineries, and the like, the capital stock, so to speak, is the major determinant of productivity growth. And productivity growth is essentially the determinant of standards of living, because per capita real GDP, which is the best general measure we have of what standards of living are, depend critically on productivity growth. And right now, the reason we are in a period of populism politically is the fact that we've gone through a protracted period in which gross domestic product in real terms used to be growing at 3.5%, sometimes 4%. We're now down to 2% or thereabouts, and over the most recent years. And that has created a very significant negative political response, and which you invariably engender demagogues, or the equivalent, mainly through Latin America, where you could see it. Whenever the standard of living went down, there'd always be somebody coming in on a white horse saying, "This is terrible. I know how to handle it. Make me your leader." And that has been a very effective source of understanding where populism comes from, because populism is not a philosophy. Capitalism is a philosophy. Socialism is philosophy. Communism is philosophy. Populism is just this cry for help. Do something. Save me. And it never varies. And what is created currently is a problem which we've never seen before in the United States. We have a president who is strangely very popular. But it's, well, I think it's strange in the sense you look in American history, it's very few examples of that. I mean, people say Andrew Jackson was populist. He was a man of the people, so to speak, and he did attract great hordes. I remember when he was first inaugurated, he invited everybody to the White House, and they made a shambles of the place. But
you can't say I remember.
I was going to say. It goes back a long way.
Anyway, he nonetheless had a sense of where the economy was going and the like, and to even think of him in the same terms as today is a mistake. So I think we're in a very extraordinary period at this stage. I do not know how it's ultimately going to come out, but it is different. I mean, productivity growth, which has been essentially averaging 2-3% per year growth, that's output per hour, we're now down at a little over 1%. We've been there for quite a while. And unless and until we attack this, and as Adrian was mentioning, what we suggest in the back of the book is what to do with entitlements. And the Swedish example he gave is is basically the means by which we could get out of it if we went in the same direction as they. But if you look at what they did, it really seems politically infeasible for the United States, but I'm not sure. I think it was probably politically infeasible for Sweden as well when they came out of that. So my final line on this is that, yes, we can come out of it, and we argue for how we can do so. It is politically extremely difficult, needless to say, but extremely difficult political situations is when innovation occurs.
Wonderful. I think I've probably gone a little bit over time, but we've got time for about 10 minutes of questions, I think. So come up to the mic if anyone has a question. Got someone?
Hi. It's a pleasure to hear from you tonight. I'm curious, when you were
to the microphone.
Yeah, when you were considering what theory by which to explain America's growth, were there other theories besides creative destruction, or were there any instances of developments of American productivity where you felt creative destruction was not the best explainer?
I'm sorry, when you get to be my age, your hearing is not as good as it should be.
So, Adrian, why don't you?
Well, did we consider any other theories other than the sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction? And are there any moments or periods of American history where it's not so good as an interpretive tool?
So, for example, was there a period when innovation was driven by the government?
Yeah, well, you can
the answer is it's such a beautiful and wonderful theory. We wouldn't have possibly considered any others. In terms of periods where it works and where it doesn't work, I mean, I think it's a brilliant explanation of what's happening between 1865 and 1914. It works incredibly well there. When you get to the post-war period, it's much more difficult because the government plays such a massive role, particularly and the inbuilt, the long-term consequences of fighting the war, which allows America to build up both a global lead and to build up this extraordinary productive capacity. That's not so much creative destruction as other things. So I would say that it's a theory that works extremely well, but it's a theory that can be modified at certain times. The other thing is that we've talked, when you're looking at the second half of the 19th century, you're seeing the creative side of creative destruction. One of the things you see in the 1970s is the necessity of destruction. America has become very complacent. Because it's the great incumbent power. You've got large numbers of industries, such as the automotive industry and the steel industry, that actually are not being destroyed as rapidly as they should be, because they're not investing in new technologies, they're not exploring new ways of doing things. So in some ways, one of America's problems is that it didn't have enough destruction in the 1970s. That's a problem that is dealt with in some ways in the 1980s. But when you become an incumbent power with very, very powerful sort of path-dependent industries, you sometimes get destruction not working in the way that you'd expect it to. People didn't think that the Japanese could produce cars until suddenly they destroyed the American car industry.
Well, the one thing that's fascinating to look at is how complex some of the analysis is to figure out, which is really the purpose of our book, what made the American economy move. But there's a countervailing force here, which is ideas which are antithetical to it. And William Jennings Bryan, as you all, I was about to say everybody knows him, but William Jennings Bryan was a 36-year-old 36-year-old Nebraskan who in the 1896 convention made this, had devastating remarks to offer about the gold standard and basically, essentially, why America was being defeated on the cross of gold. But the real issue here wasn't the issue of gold, it was the Civil War. The Civil War basically increased the price level in the United States very significantly, so that when the Civil War was over, one of the things that most everybody agreed to was that we have to get the price level back to the level that it was prior, because we were on a gold standard, and I don't want to get into the complexities of pricing, but what that did, there was an act that made, basically said by 1870, we had to get the price level down, and indeed we did. But in that whole period, what we learned is that falling prices have a very significantly different impact than rising prices. It's not symmetrical. And that in periods of declining prices, you get not only populism, but you get all sorts of reactions which are negative beyond what one would ordinarily expect. And William Jennings Bryan essentially changed the structure of this political discussion in the United States from laissez-faire, as close as you can get to it, to what eventually developed through Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, and actually Woodrow Wilson as well, a very significant shift in the direction of inflating. And declining prices have a far more negative effect on the politics of the economy and how people respond. John Maynard Keynes talked about sticky wages. People respond very negatively to that.
So,
hi. So, we live in like an era where companies like Facebook, Netflix, Google, Uber, they all have market caps in the hundreds of billions and even hitting the trillion. Do you think that Americans' innate support for creative destruction has led to these extraordinarily high valuations of these companies, which perhaps represent the pinnacle of creative destruction?
Well, I think it's extraordinary to look at the late 19th century when America seizes the initiative globally in new technologies such as steel, such as petroleum, then such as automobiles and electricity, and creates very, very rapidly these giant companies. And we're seeing exactly the same thing going on now in Silicon Valley. So with Facebook, I don't care about, but Amazon and Google, serious companies like that. And America has the capacity to seize on technological innovations, technological changes, and create out of them giant companies which commercialize these ideas. So I think we see there an extraordinary continuity in American history. America is better than any other country in the world at creating entrepreneurs. It's better than any other country in the world of creating companies which can commercialize new ideas very, very rapidly. So an extraordinary continuity. But at the same time, I don't think we're seeing innovations spreading throughout the economy as quickly as they used to. So what we're seeing is the creation of superstar companies which manage to hoard innovations in all sorts of ways, through patent protections, through buying up competitors, through network effects, which means that what Schumpeter says is it's great to have giant, big companies so long as they're constantly being threatened and so long as the innovations that they're creating are constantly being disseminated through the economy, spread throughout the economy. And we're not seeing that as much as I certainly would like with those companies. I mean, great companies, but let's make sure that they don't last forever.
You know what is fascinating about the current period is all of the major technological innovations that were starting from the transistor and integrated circuits and the like, all were developed within the United States. And what that clarifies is that this innovation issue was not strictly the 19th century and early part. I mean, there's a very famous book by Walter Isaacson on I've forgotten his technology, innovators. And what struck me about the book, which is a fascinating book, we're selling another book, but it's a fascinating book, but what struck me at the end of it is all the innovators were American. Now, what that does is gets us back to the latter part of the 18th century. That same culture which basically exploded the United States as a world economic power is still there.
Yeah.
And all we have to do is uncover it.
Exactly. So.
What is causing the continued growth in wealth inequality? Should the government have a role in controlling it, or maybe even managing and reversing it? And if so, what should it do?
I'm sorry, I didn't...
What's causing the continued growth in wealth inequality? Does it matter? What should the government do about it?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult problem which emerges because of the fact that the growth in technology has no limit. The quality of the capital stock has no limit, but human intelligence does. In other words, the IQs, I mean, if we could do, went back and, took, I would say, go back in American history and looked at who were the most intelligent people, the major innovators, they all had an extraordinary level of intelligence, but as you get farther on into the 20th century, there are fewer and fewer, smaller and smaller percentages of the society who have the intellectual capability to deal with the extraordinary complexity of what the new world is developing. And what that means is that because there's a level of human intelligence which you can't, I mean, you go back and look at all of the major intellectual advances since the 15th century. They all can show a level of IQ which doesn't continuously increase from one society or generation to the next. But the quality of the technological stock is always increasing. Therefore, the incomes are flowing inordinately towards a smaller and smaller part of the labor force. And because that is the case, you get the extraordinary problem of inequality, which I frankly find to be the most hidden major political problem that we have. But I'm not sure what the cure is, because you have to change human nature. And how we go about that is a job in itself.
So you can't change it through taxation policy.
You can't do
it. Marginalized.
Well, you can do it up to a certain point, but then the question is you're eventually going to reach a ceiling. The ceiling does not, the capability of individuals to improve intellectually is not there, but the level of capital stock is changing. And this is the major, we're not quite there yet. There's a big problem in the future, which is going to occur as a consequence of human intelligence being basically the average level being pretty flat, and the consequence of that is a ever higher proportion of income going to a smaller and smaller part of the society. Taxation will only do part of it, and it doesn't do it very well.
So we have one last question, I think.
So I think Mr. Greenspan actually kind of answered my question. It's basically about the increasing difference between the most educated and the least educated people in the U.S., and whether maybe improving education would help regain momentum when it comes to creative destruction, and whether rethinking, reshaping educational system in the U.S. might be the cure for to get back on track and lead the economic progress.
Did you hear that?
No, I didn't.
It's about the how important is it to reshape the education system to get back on track and produce economic progress?
Well, it depends on how you define what the nature of the problem is. And the problem is that, I mentioned you go back in history, and Archimedes you could just look at what he developed from that period of time through Einstein, through where we are today. They all have extraordinarily high levels of intelligence, but it's not obvious that we're increasing. In other words, it's not obvious that Aeschylus or any of the other Newton, for example, is an extraordinary example of a level of intelligence, seeing the real world and knowing how it functions. But it's not obvious that he and, say, Einstein, generations later, are not of the basically same level. But the issue is you can't get human intelligence improving with the limits which are pretty clearly there, but you can always get technology improving, and technology is where the incomes flow. The person who invents the iPhone, for example, becomes a billionaire. Well, why does he? Basically because that is the way the markets function.
Yes, I must say it doesn't concern me overwhelmingly that that Bill Gates has got billions of dollars, or that Steve Jobs had billions of dollars, because they were creating innovations which improved all of our lives, and which and they did this by producing products which got cheaper and got better and got more useful. So if people are making money out of doing that, just as Carnegie made money out of making steel better and higher quality, if that's the way they're making their money, well, that's fine. But if you have people who are rent-seeking, who are crony capitalists, who are doing it through political connections, the power of excluding other people from markets and becoming rich in that way, then that does worry me. I mean, there's good inequality and bad inequality, and by all means, bad inequality.
And I do think it's significant that both Steve Jobs and Bill Gates dropped out of college. So never.
So please all leave.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the evening. Can you give these two gentlemen a hand?